Representative democracy is the most common mode of government in the Western world, but rule by the people, as it is literally known in Greek, has been practiced for millennia. In an era of absolute monarchy, aristocratic rule and tyranny the world over, the famous Greek city of Athens began its rise to prominence on the Attic Peninsula. We know that this legendary polis would eventually become one of the most radical political experiments in history, but that was centuries in the future. In this video, we present the origins of Athenian democracy and how two great leaders set the stage for it hundreds of years before. Napoleon famously said that an army marches on its stomach, implying that being well provisioned is one of the most important matters for a fighting force. And the sponsor of this video, Magic Spoon, is eager to provide you with a nutritious breakfast that will allow you to fight your daily battles. It's hard to overstate how nutritious Magic Spoon's cereal is. Each serving comes with 14 grams of protein and 4 grams of carbs. But most importantly, if you're trying to lose weight, 0 grams of sugar and just 140 calories. And all that comes in a variety of tasty flavors. Among them are favorites, fruity and blueberry, which are delicious. Magic Spoon cereal is also keto-friendly, gluten-free, soy-free and GMO-free. They're so confident in their product, it's backed with a 100% happiness guarantee. If you don't like it for any reason, they'll refund your money, no questions asked. So what are you waiting for? Support our channel and get yourself some delicious breakfasts. Click the link below to grab a variety pack and try it today. Be sure to use the promo code Kings and Generals at checkout to get $5 off any order. Or go to magicspoon.com/kingsandgenerals to save $5 off your order today. Thucydides informs us that it was the mythical Athenian king, Theseus, who first unified Athens and its surrounding Attic Peninsula into one polis, or city-state, for the first time during the Mycenaean Age, with the city remaining relatively unremarkable among its fellow cities until the beginning of the 7th century BC. During the period and through events we have no real knowledge of, Athens' monarchs were deposed and replaced as rulers of the state by 3 high officials known as Archons. These Archons were the Basileus, who was in charge of religious and state rituals, the Polemarch, responsible for war, foreign and military affairs, and the so-called eponymous Archon, who functioned as the chief magistrate of the state and was responsible for general administration. Below the 3 Archons was a body of privileged citizens known as the Areopagos, an assembly of elders which seems to have performed a vaguely defined function similar to that of the Roman Senate. We know that the Areopagos was primarily made up of seasoned citizens who had occupied the office of Archon in the past and was therefore probably an oligarchic institution. This can be assumed because although we have no real knowledge of the Archon selection process, we are aware that they were chosen from citizens of noble birth and considerable wealth, again like the Roman Senate. It may have been that the monarchy had been deposed in an oligarchic coup, imperfectly mirroring the establishment of Rome's Republic in Italy. The Archons, with the advice of the Areopagos, were the rulers of early archaic Athens. Despite the city's increasing prosperity, tension in the upper echelons of Athenian society were ever present, just as they were in the rest of Greece. In 632 BC, an Athenian aristocrat named Cylon attempted to become the Tyrannos, the tyrant of Athens, with the help of his high-born circle of allies and his father-in-law, who was the tyrant of neighbouring Megara. The insurrectionists and their allies managed to occupy the Acropolis, but the expected support never emerged, and Cylon was besieged on the hill. While he eventually escaped, his men were massacred on the order of the eponymous Archon at the time, Megacles, a member of the Alcmaeonid family. We'll hear a lot more about them quite soon. This seemed to be the end of the matter. Cylon had made a blundering and incompetent attempt at seizing power, for which the perpetrators had been properly punished. However, around 30 years after the initial coup, Cylon's family appears to have regained much of its influence and prominence in Athenian society. With this influence, they made their move, accusing the Alcmaeonids, who were probably aristocratic rivals of theirs, of sacrilege for having murdered Chilon's plotters, who had taken sanctuary in a sacred place after the failure of 632's revolt. In a stunning turn of events, the whole Alcmaeonid family were then thrown out of the city and cursed, with even the bones of their ancestors being exhumed and then expelled from Athens. It's probable this was just a pretense for throwing out a family who seemed to have been disliked by the rest of the aristocracy, a victim of its complex interfamilial politics. At the turn of the 6th century, social conditions in Athens and much of Greece as a whole had become unbearable for much of the population, particularly those poorer freemen who worked the land. A significant amount of them had become impoverished under the system of hectomorioi, tenant farmers who paid 1/6 of their produce to a landowner, much like a feudal serf to their lord in the Middle Ages. It is almost certain that this system emerged as a result of land ownership transferred from individual farmers to rich creditors as a result of debt. However, many hectomorioi were unable to pay the 6th tithe, and by the year 600, the situation was one of anger and resentment. Athens was a slave-holding city, and many of the poor farmers had been forced to sell their families and themselves into slavery to pay the debt. Similar conditions proliferated all over Greece at this time as well, and many cities had, as a consequence, undergone revolutions, resulting in a single individual rising to power as a tyrant. The noble families of Athens were definitely aware of this, and of the possibility that one family might try to do the same thing in their city. It is possible that this is what the Alcmaeonid family were attempting to do in order to irritate the other aristocrats so much. As we know all too well, the highborn factions of almost every ancient society competed with one another ferociously, and any single family gaining dominance would have probably resulted in massive discontent. The underlying conditions behind this threat would have to be solved, and quickly. Prospective tyrants needed to have support, and a prospective Athenian dictator might gain that support from impoverished farmers or other disadvantaged groups by promising to alleviate their situation. It might also have occurred to the rulers of Athens that this constant unrest might make it difficult to raise a unified army when needed, and it was beginning to look like it might be. Megara, the neighbouring city-state to the west, was becoming more hostile by the day and even occupied Salamis. It was clear to all that a radical solution was necessary. For this reason, the Areopagos appointed a dictator-like figure to govern Athens in order to solve the state's problems, a dictator known as Solon. He was a prominent noble who supposedly traced his descent from one of the Athenian kings of old, and was appointed for his status as the wisest man in Athens. While Solon possessed wealth, it came from trade rather than land ownership, a fact which distanced him from most of the other nobility and excluded him from their circles. More relevantly to the job he had now, Solon had also acquired a reputation for common sense and moderation in politics, and was also a poet. We still have many of his works today. Solon's reforms were driven by his sense of justice, social ethics, and knowledge of Athens' mechanisms of political life. He obviously realized that he was dealing with an unjust society, even by ancient standards, which was heavily in favor of a hereditary oligarchy at the expense of everyone else. While Solon was determined to make sweeping changes, he was determined to do it without inflicting injustice on those who had wealth and power, seeing himself as a mediator, standing between the well-born, or agathoi, and the lowly freemen, or kakoi. On his watch, balance would be achieved and reforms enacted which would allow neither side to unjustly triumph over the other. Any other way, he believed, would fail and result in mass bloodshed. Solon's first concern was the primary grievance of the poor in Athens: debt. He abolished the system which allowed lending with a person as security for repayment, ended the hectomorioi system, liberated those who had been trapped in that position, and even gave them back ownership of their old land. This series of debt-cancelling acts was known as seisachthia, shaking off the burdens. The poor subsequently began to demand seizures of land from the rich. but Solon remarkably did not cave to pressure on this front. He would be a moderate and saw this as simple greed and pursuit of excess. Such enforced equality in the distribution of wealth was neither just nor necessary. The cause of the poor would not be advanced through injustice to others. Despite this, Solon was well aware that massive wealth inequality was a barrier to civic harmony, and protected the population against food shortages by restricting exports, thus preventing high prices. In his own words, Solon wrote in a poem, "I wrote laws equally for the lowborn and the wellborn, which offered upright justice to everyone." To cap his achievements off, he founded a law court known as the Heliaia, at which all citizens could bring lawsuits to receive justice. In addition to radically resolving the debt problems, Solon also expanded political participation in Athens. The political establishment, solely consisting of wealthy hereditary aristocrats, would be reworked in order to include a more broad swath of Athens' citizens. It was divided into 4 classes on the basis of landed property, wealth and produce, from wealthiest aristocrats to lowly labourers. These were the Pentakosiomedimnoi, the Hippeis, Zeugitai, and Thetes. In this newly categorized system, the Archons were retained, but election to the post was now open to anyone from the top 2 wealth classes. While almost all of the former aristocracy did enter these 2 groups, it also comprised a large group of non-nobles. This had a knock-on effect which is crucial. Since members of the Areopagos Council were drawn from ex-Archons, it naturally became less exclusively aristocratic over time. Lower offices, which seemed to have involved primarily financial matters, were open to the first 2 classes, but also the third, while the Thetes were mostly excluded from politics, but were permitted to join the new popular assembly, the Ecclesia. Interestingly, Solon seems to have received assurances from the Areopagos in advance that his reforms would be accepted for a period of 10 years, whatever they were. Things in Athens must have been truly grim for this radical solution to have been contemplated. When he was done, Solon laid aside his supreme powers and went abroad for 10 years. These were revolutionary changes, but unfortunately, they didn't resolve every problem, as the great reformer had hoped. Disruptive rivalry continued unabated amongst the noble families, and many farmers found themselves once again in debt due to lack of funds. They couldn't be enslaved anymore, but were still chained to their creditors due to this debt. In the years after Solon's reforms, there were still ongoing signs of conflict in Athens. Archons were repeatedly left unappointed due to a lack of factional consensus, and on another occasion, an outgoing Archon even refused to lay down the position, aiming to become a tyrant. In some ways, Solon's reforms had changed everything, but in many others, nothing had changed at all. This time, Athens fell to the fate that Solon had so vehemently warned against, and 3 significant factions emerged. The Athenians of the plain were under the leadership of Lycurgus, son of Aristolydes, while the coastal faction were guided by Megacles, who was a member of the Alcmaeonid family, which seemingly had returned after their previous cursing and banishment and were up to their old tricks. In addition to these groups, the Hill faction was under the leadership of a figure known as Peisistratus. After tricking the Athenians into giving him a powerful bodyguard of fellow citizens, Peisistratus used them to rise up and take the Acropolis, becoming tyrant in 561. While Solon himself died soon after, tradition tells us that he actually worked with Peisistratus during the early stages of his tyranny. Although his reforms hadn't been perhaps as successful as he would have liked, Solon's name and deeds would become immortal. He is now known as one of the legendary 7 sages of Greece, the man who paved the way for democracy in Athens. Peisistratus himself initially ruled for 5 years, before being expelled by Lycurgus and Megacles. Unfortunately for them, the 2 remaining factions immediately began squabbling amongst themselves, leading the Alcmaeonid-led group to plot Peisistratus' return by marrying the daughter of Megacles. The plan to get Peisistratus back is truly one of the most strange and elaborate pieces of Athenian history. An incredibly tall and beautiful woman was brought into the city from the countryside, mounted on a chariot and equipped in full armor. Heralds walked in front of the chariot, proclaiming that this woman, who was supposedly the goddess Athena, had stated that the Athenians should welcome Peisistratus back into the city. Amazingly, the people were apparently persuaded that the woman was Athena, and so Peisistratus returned. Even Herodotus, who lived about a century after these events, stated, "They devised a plan to bring Peisistratus back, which, to my mind, was so exceedingly foolish that it is strange." As we've come to expect, he was quickly embroiled in factionalism again and deposed. Then, finally, in 546, Peisistratus was installed in Athens with the help of Thebes and Thracian mercenaries, staying in power until his death in 527. In the modern age, we generally view tyrants as bad purely by definition, but most sources tell us that Peisistratus was a benevolent dictator and good to the people. He generally maintained Solon's laws and showed that they could work, but also ensured that all of the highest offices went to his own supporters. His governance also began a golden age in Athenian life. Action was taken to ensure the economic situation of poor farmers was improved by offering state loans and grants to them. These financial aids were paid for by a 10% flat tax on all produce, which was essentially a measure transferring excess profits from rich farmers to poorer ones, because the wealthy paid more tax in absolute terms. Peisistratus added to Athens' prosperity and his own popularity further by commissioning the construction of numerous public works, such as statues and temples. This was a common strategy, because it both created employment and served as a symbol of national pride. The tyrant also showed a keen interest in promoting state religion and the big festivals that Athenians commonly celebrated. He established a new occasion known for centuries after as the Dionysia, and greatly expanded other existing festivals, in particular the Panathenaea, an annual festival in honor of Athena, the patron god of Athens. Even more impactful was his patronization of the arts and culture, by which he attracted many of the greatest literary figures of his day to Athens. It was during this period of tyranny, for example, that the famous Greek tragedy genre of play began to proliferate around Hellas. In short, Athens was quickly becoming a cultural hub, and Professor Thomas N. Mitchell puts the situation like this. There can be little doubt that Peisistratus' cultural policy and broad patronage of the arts helped pave the way for the golden age of art, architecture, literary creativity, and philosophical inquiry that flowered at Athens over the following century. Peisistratus' rule also had less material effects. By the expulsion or flight of many aristocratic families who opposed the tyrant, he undermined the already weakening dominance of the noble class. Others who remained found it easier to simply submit and cooperate so they could retain their possessions and status. The long length of Peisistratus' tyranny accustomed people to look to the tyrant for their well-being, a fact which over time broke down the earlier forms of dependency which had solidified the aristocratic system. Clear evidence exists of increased prosperity during this period, and the tyrant no doubt gave the lower and middle-class people on whom he depended a better life. The whole character of Peisistratus' rule, combined with his maintenance of Solon's earlier reforms, left it incredibly unlikely that the old aristocratic system would return. In this way, by the time he died in 527, the great tyrant had assisted in laying the foundations not only for an unprecedented cultural flourishing, but also for the new democracy which would emerge in the coming century. We'll be covering more on the origins of Athenian democracy in upcoming videos, so make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button to see the next video in the series. Please consider liking, commenting and sharing, it helps immensely. Our videos would be impossible without our kind patrons and YouTube channel members, whose ranks you can join via the links in the description to know our schedule, get early access to our videos, access our Discord, and much more. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one.